In this module, we will be talking about data collection. There are numerous recording systems you can use in order to measure behavior. Regardless of the recording system, you use this system in order to progress monitor the extent to which behaviors are changing or the extent to which interventions are working or not working. As I said, there are numerous observation recording systems. We will go through each of these as this module continues. The first recording system is the event recording, or otherwise known as frequency count. This system offers the most direct and accurate reflection for the number of times a behavior occurs. It's used to keep track of each time the behavior occurs within a specified time period. That is a standardized time. The standardized time should be used the same throughout this recording system. That is, during math time, or during reading time, or the first 20 minutes of the day, for example. It needs to be standardized in order to compare data points from day to day. There are strategies in which we will talk about if you can't find a standardized time. Event recording is used with discrete behaviors that are not too frequent. Discrete behaviors are behaviors that are what we call as event behaviors. They have a very discrete beginning and ending, and they're rather quick behaviors, such as tapping a pencil or pointing to an object. Those would be examples of discrete behaviors. You also use event recording when the objective is to increase or decrease the number of times that specific behavior occurs. There are numerous ways in which you can use event recording to record the number of times the behavior occurs. Some ideas include putting tally marks or slash marks on a piece of paper during that observation time. Moving around the classroom as you're teaching can be difficult to measure behavior. Another strategy can be to take a mailing label or a sticky piece of paper and put it on your arm or a piece of clothing that you know where it's going to be at all times. So as you're moving around the classroom, as the behavior occurs, you can just find that piece of paper very quickly because it's in the same spot and just quickly make a slash as you're moving throughout the classroom. Another strategy would be putting paper clips or some sort of small, tiny object in one pocket, and as the behavior occurs, take that paper clip from the left pocket and move it to the right pocket as that behavior occurs. At the end of the observation or the end of the lesson, you would go to that right pocket, count how many paper clips were in that pocket, and that's the number of times that behavior occurred. There's also counters that you can use. Here on the screen, you see a little golf counter where you tap that lever, and as you depress that lever, the number increases. There are technological counters that you can use. If you have a smartphone, there are several free applications that you can download, and you can just hit the plus button as that behavior occurs on your phone. Here's an example of a recording sheet that you can use for event recording. It asks for several pieces of information at the top that can be used when discussing the behavior over time. And in the box in the middle, you can either use this to make your slashes, or if you use the paperclip method, for example, you can just transfer the total number of times that the behavior occurred by counting those number and paperclips and recording it in that box. You'll see at the bottom, there's a rate ratio that you can use, which we will talk about next, about how to convert your tally marks into rates if you can't have a standardized time period. So if sessions are not equal in length, you need to convert your events into rate. When you convert it into rate, this allows you to compare sessions if the observations aren't in the same length. That is, if you watch a student for 10 minutes and the next day you watch the student for 15 minutes, those event recordings aren't going to be comparable. So you have to convert it into the rate in order for those to be comparable. It's very easy to do this. You just simply count the total number of times, the total tallies from that observation, as well as the length of time, and you compute the rate. When you're computing rate, it's important to make sure that that rate of time is consistent across the rates. That is, if you start with minutes, keep minutes throughout the rest of the time that you're converting it into rate, or seconds, for example. So you easily convert the rate by counting the total number of tallies, and you simply divide it by time, and that's going to give you that rate. So if the behavior happens 27 times in a 15-minute observation, I would divide 27 by 15 minutes, and that would equal 1.8 times per minute. I could also translate that into times per second by taking that 15 and replacing it with 90, for example. So advantages of event recording include its accuracy. It's an accurate method of measuring that behavior. It's very easy for you to implement and employ. Even if you are still teaching the classroom, this can be very easy for you to do as you're teaching or for someone to come in and observe. Some disadvantages include it not being useful for continuous behavior. That is, for a student, a continuous behavior would be off-task behavior, for example, because it doesn't have a concrete or discrete beginning and end, and it takes a long period of time. It's also not very easy to use for high-frequency behaviors, because if it's happening frequently in your classroom, it can be difficult to teach and count that behavior all throughout that class period. But it can be used for discrete behaviors. It can be used for academic behaviors, such as number of words correct. It can be used with multiple students. It can be used with multiple behaviors simultaneously, so long as you have two different tally mark systems to be able to record those simultaneous behaviors. And it can also be used with unequal session lengths when you convert it into that rate that we talked about at the previous slide. The next recording system is called duration recording. You use this when the primary concern is in the length of time a student engages in a particular behavior. It's best used for behaviors that have an easily identifiable beginning and end, for example, a student being out of the classroom or a student's engagement with an activity or lack of engagement. You use duration recording by simply starting and stopping a stopwatch. You see an example of a stopwatch at the side. You just simply hit that start button when you see the behavior starting, and then when it's stopped, you just simply hit the stop button and it'll stop that time from continuing. As the observation continues, you just keep on hitting that start button when the behavior occurs and the stop button as the student stops. At the end of the observation, you would just record the total number of time that student engaged in that particular behavior. After the observation, you need to take the duration of time and calculate a percentage of time that student was engaged in that behavior. Here's an example on the screen of how you can record the percentage of time the student was engaged in that behavior. You have the date, you record the start time, you record the end time, and then you also record the time on the stopwatch, so the total amount of time that student was engaged in that behavior. This needs to be converted into a percentage of time. So, since I have the student being engaged for 7 minutes and 35 seconds, I need to convert the 7 minutes into seconds so I have the same time duration. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see that I'm also converting my 15 minutes into seconds because I need to have that same unit of time when converting my percentage. I also am converting my 7 minutes and 35 seconds into seconds. So here, 7 minutes and 35 seconds equals 455 seconds. I have 420 seconds which is 7 minutes. I also have that 35 seconds. I add the two together to get that 455 seconds. I'm then going to take that 435 seconds, the time that student was engaged, divide it by the total duration of the observation, so 90 seconds. I'm going to multiply that number by 100, and I'm going to get 50.56. This tells me that my student was engaged 50.56% of time during that 15-minute observation. The next recording system is called latency recording. This recording system is very similar to duration recording. It's best used for behaviors that have an easily identifiable beginning and end, and it's used when the primary concern is in the length of time it takes for a student to engage in a particular behavior. For example, You as a teacher give an instruction for a student to engage in an assignment, and it takes the student some significant time to begin that assignment. You might be interested in using latency recording. Here in this example, you would still have a stopwatch, just like duration recording, after you've given the instruction, such as complete the assignment. You hit the start button on the stopwatch, and you're going to watch that student and watch and record the amount of time it takes for them to engage in that assignment. So you give the instruction, you start the timer, you watch that student, and once that student starts to work on that assignment, you hit the stop button. And that tells you the number of seconds or the number of minutes or the amount of time it takes for that student to engage in that behavior. Just like duration recording, you want to record the percentage of time it takes that student to engage in that behavior. You'll see the same time that I've put here. I'll just leave this here. I'm not going to go over it again, but you can refer back to this on how to calculate the percentage of time for latency by converting your minutes into seconds, dividing the seconds together to get the amount of time it took for that student to engage in that particular task. The next recording system is called interval recording. There are two types of interval recording. One is partial interval recording and one is whole interval recording. When using partial interval recording, here you would be recording if instances of the discrete behavior occurred at all during that interval. Here, using partial interval recording, this overestimates the occurrence of behavior. You also use partial interval recording when you are desiring to see a decrease in that behavior, such as off-task behavior. When using whole interval recording, you are going to see if the behavior consumes that entire interval. So did the behavior occur for that entire interval? With whole interval recording, this underestimates the occurrence of the behavior. It's used when you are seeking to increase behavior, such as on-task behavior. When using interval recording, you need to define a specific time period to observe the target behavior in the student. Usually these observations are not more than 30 minutes in length. After you've defined that specific time period, you need to divide the observation period into equal intervals. Typically these intervals are seconds in length and are not exceeding 30 seconds. So anywhere between 10 to 30 seconds is probably a good interval length, according to the literature. Once you've divided them into intervals and you are observing the student, you're putting a plus mark or a minus mark in that interval on if the behavior occurred, a plus, or the behavior did not occur by recording a minus. After the observation, you count the total number of intervals in which the behavior occurred. Here on the right-hand side, you see that I have 20 intervals. I've counted the total number of pluses, which gives me 10 out of 20, which tells me that the student engaged in the specific behavior for 50% of intervals. When recording a plus, it's important that you remember if you're using whole or partial interval. With partial interval, a plus tells me that the behavior occurred at any point during that interval. With whole interval, a plus tells me that the behavior happened through the entire duration of that interval. So if my observations or my intervals are 30 seconds in length, in this example, with partial interval, that first interval would tell me that at any point in time that student engaged in that target behavior at some point, even if it was only 1 second of that 30 seconds, I'm going to put a plus in that first interval. If I'm using whole interval and I look at this recording sheet, this tells me that the student engaged in that particular behavior for the entire 30-second interval. Tells me that that's what a plus is. When you're using interval recording, you must have at least 20 intervals. This is according to the literature. When you have less than 20 intervals, it does not give you an accurate reflection of how much time that behavior happens with that child. There's some advantages and disadvantages to this recording. The next recording system is called momentary time sampling. Momentary time sampling is very similar to interval recording, where you divide the observation into equal intervals, such as every 2 minutes, and you record whether the behavior occurs at a specific point in time. Oftentimes, momentary time sampling is used on a timing or beeping system. When the beep goes off, you just momentarily, split second, you look at the student once that beeper goes off and see if the student's engaged or not engaged in a particular behavior. Some advantages to time sampling is it's practical while you're simultaneously teaching and data collection. Here, using momentary time sampling, you can still teach your lesson and quickly look up at the student every 10 seconds when the beeper goes off to see if they're engaged or not engaged in a particular behavior. It allows for data collection across an entire class period. You're going to be less fatigued when doing it this way. It's also best for behaviors that are very frequent or long in duration. Disadvantages include it being the least sensitive method for data recording. And you can only draw limited conclusions based off of the recorded behavior. Here, for an example, you'll see that the observation is divided into 10 seconds. So here at the arrows, this is going to give you an indication as to when you are looking at the student. So instead of looking at the student for the entire minute, the entire 60 seconds, I'm only looking at that student 6 times during that minute, every 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds, a beeper will go off, beep, look at the student to see if the student's engaged or not engaged and record on your recording system. Then another 10 seconds lapses, beep, I look at the student, see if they're engaged or not engaged. And this is going to happen throughout the duration of the observation. Your recording system can be very similar to interval recording system, as you see on the right-hand side, the same example. Here, when you calculate the percentage of intervals, you divide the total number of yeses or pluses divided by the total intervals. So here, Jody was observed to be on task in 12 out of the 20 intervals, or 60% of total intervals. Again, this recording system needs to have a minimum of 20 intervals in order for data to be reflective. Regardless of the recording system, it's best to graph your data to get an idea on if behavior is changing. Baseline here is where intervention is not in place, and intervention is where your intervention is in place. Regardless of the interval system, you're going to put a little dot, make a little line graph on the percentage of intervals or the percentage of time that student engaged in that particular behavior. This is important to graph your data in order for you to have a visual analysis on if the student is improving or not improving in their behavior. Given that there are a lot of data recording systems out there, there is a systematic way on how you can choose the appropriate recording system. Using this flowchart, you have your target behavior, the behavior that you want changed in the student, and you ask yourself, do I want to know the number of times that behavior happens with the numerical dimension of behavior, or do I want to know the total duration, the total time, the temporal dimension of behavior? If my behavior, I've decided that I want to know the amount of the frequency or the number of times the behavior occurs, I'm going to stay on this numerical dimension of behavior. And then I'm going to ask myself, is this behavior discrete or is it continuous? If it's discrete and low in frequency, I'm going to use event recording. If it's discrete or continuous, I can use event recording or time sampling. If it's occurring at high frequency, I'm going to use event recording. If it's occurring at a moderate frequency, I'm going to use time sampling. Although this is systematic, it's also dependent upon how and who is measuring the behavior. You have to figure out how you best can get the most accurate representation of the behavior and who is actually going to be measuring that behavior. whether it's you as the teacher or an outside observer. If I want to know the total amount of time a behavior is occurring, I want to stay on the right side, the temporal dimension of behavior. And then I need to ask myself, do I want to know the amount of time it takes for the response to initiate? I'm going to use latency recording. If I want to know the time it takes between response and termination, I want to use duration recording. So in conclusion, there are several data recording systems that you can use. Here is just in conclusion, we went over event recording, we did interval recording, momentary time sampling, duration recording, and latency recording. Use the flow chart in the prior slide in order to give you a better idea onto what recording system you should use.